focus on almost all wars is on the home front, because they're not going to ask you about battles. It's just not. It's not how the College Board considers relevant to this. Now, my degree was in military history, so I didn't start out as what we would call a social historian. I didn't focus on that part of history, but live and learn, right? So we were talking about the problem of being able to coordinate a very big nation all at one time without compulsion. In other words, you're not making people do this stuff. So, please recognize that eventually the WIB does have to, I think, get involved in running a little bit, making the trains run on time, literally, because without this, they can't quite, expect to get anything to Europe, all right, including the materials for our soldiers. And of course, daylight savings time, which we're just now experiencing the joy of losing an hour of sleep. But I love long days. They're much nicer. So anywho, there are going to be a couple agencies, and each of these agencies are going to have differing sort of standards, I guess you might say. But we'll start with the War Labor Board. And the War Labor Board implemented something called work or fight. And so what that meant was, if you were unemployed, or you were protesting, or you were a picketer, or you were on strike, then you would be drafted into the armed forces. So if you had a good job, you had a job, then you wouldn't be considered a target for this. But if you didn't, or if you were protesting, then the War Department would draft you. And I'll point out that the War Department is how we used to call the Defense Department. They didn't. We had a War Department. So the key thing that you're going to learn about during this period is that this was a tough period economically for the lowest of working class people. This was not bad for the AFL. Keep in mind, the AFL are skilled unions, right? Skilled. So Gompers, historically very, very patriotic, in terms of supporting American efforts. Skilled workers. And so when you have a skilled worker, the demand for that job is fairly high. And so these folks have what we would call leverage, right, in terms of economic negotiations. So they're going to get the 8-hour workday, right? And that's a huge gain that's been coming since the days of the populists. But still no right to no collective bargaining. Right. So what that means is they don't get to basically negotiate with the companies and sort of demand better pay or better working conditions. So they're still not quite as far along. Now, the Wobblies were typically the most dangerous, like miners and lack of skills. So this was this was kind of like a precursor to a communist syndicate union. Like they wanted to really tear down the corporate world, so to speak. So the Wobblies were frequently targets, including their president, Bill Haywood, for the government prosecution. Keep in mind, the AFL also saw its membership double during this period. So if you were a union that was sort of part of the loyal to the to the nation's war effort, then you usually saw yourself pretty successful. Now, the guy who becomes almost legendary during this period is Herbert Hoover. Now, Herbert Hoover is one of those great rags to riches stories of history. He was a poor orphan who will end up becoming a CEO of a mining industry and become a multimillionaire. So he's going to write rags to riches kind of story. He had already operated the Relief of Belgium agency. So the federal government sort of wanted to help the people of Belgium, and he ran the food part of that. And so Hoover is going to come in and administer the war administration. And it's going to be Hoover who starts his very, very famous propaganda campaign of things like Wheatless Wednesdays. okay, and meatless Tuesdays. So what this means is, rather than mandate that you not eat food, right? And I've thought about this with the mask, right? If we had just inundated information, including with President Trump, then maybe mask wearing wouldn't have had to be mandated, right? It would have been something that Americans would recognize what you should do. But unfortunately, that's not how we work anymore. So during World War I, people are going to sacrifice. And I have been alive since the Vietnam War, and never once in my life have I been literally asked to sacrifice for a war. We don't live like this anymore. We don't, we send our soldiers and Marines, airmen and sailors, millions of, people, billions of dollars, excuse me, thousands of miles around the world, and then we don't follow them. We don't pay attention to them. We sure as heck don't give up anything for them. So we were asked to sacrifice. We were asked to do our part, and even prohibition was included as kind of that sacrifice. Other agencies would then imitate this. The Fuel Administration would make posters and have reduced oil consumption, reduced coal consumption, and the Liberty Loan drives are how we're going to fund the war. 2/3 of World War I is going to be funded by debt, by float, just like the Civil War, just like major wars, all major wars. We're gonna have what are called Liberty loans. So we're loaning the government money in the defense of liberty. All right, and all of these programs are going to be the war of the posters. You're going to have these fantastic posters displayed throughout America, all over everywhere where there's a surface that you can put a poster on. Here you can see the spirit of 18, which is reminiscent of the spirit of 76. Instead of the fife and drummer with the guy holding the flag, you have farmers who are growing grains and vegetables, looking like George Washington there. And it says, "The world cry food, keep the home garden going." So, during the war, you would see people who didn't ordinarily do this grow produce in their own gardens. People who would raise livestock in places you wouldn't expect it. So here you can see, don't consume sugar, but rather buy molasses and sugarcane syrup. So this, again, food not only for the soldiers, which would be a large part of the food, but also for the relief of these European countries, particularly the Belgians and the Dutch and the French, right? So don't waste food while others starve. You would also see things like the War Garden Commission was created. So here's children being taught in school, build a U.S. school garden army, help can the Kaiser. We had in Pittsylvania County here, we had a cannery that people went to and did jarring together as a community. You could bring all your produce there, and it was big pressure cookers. You could jar your tomatoes or your green beans. And so this was a way to, save food. Here's another agency, the Shipping Board, trying to make sure that the fleet of both service ships, like vessels that are carrying cargo, but also carrying the American people, American soldiers. Here's the Fuel Administration. Don't use that extra shovel of coal. Only burn small amounts. Check your gasoline. Make sure it's not leaking. So lots and lots of volunteerism. And if I had to put a star beside how all of these basically worked, it was to rely on propaganda and volunteerism. Like, we're going to really sell you this as a patriotic message. Like, doing this is your duty. And very rarely did you have to see people do anything other than this. Although there were instances of people getting actually tarred and feathered, and for not participating. Now, good and bad of this, good and bad. So how do we weight? How do we rank this? So it definitely dealt with the problem of unemployment. Like, America reached full employment during this period. So much so that you're going to see a vast movement of people for jobs. Obviously, this is more government involvement in the economy. Okay, some would consider it at the time excessive. There was clearly mismanagement. So this sounds like a federal government note in general. But it was designed not to be controlled, but rather cooperation. So I want to really, point that out. It was the whole system, and it went with Wilson's vision of what being an American was. and with his staff. And you might notice that Hoover is a Republican and Wilson was a Democrat, so it looked like this was going to be a bipartisan approach. They say politics ends at the water's edge, meaning foreign policy, the way we deal with foreign countries, should not be a partisan issue. Nonetheless, you're going to see a huge change in the dynamic for African Americans. Okay, so particularly one of the most notable events in history, which is called the Great Migration. Okay, now this is the beginning of the Great Migration. The Great Migration will ultimately grow to be a sort of avalanche or a flurry of movement of people, right? But initially, the folks that are leaving the South are African Americans. You know, this is the Great Migration of Black folks, of African Americans, sometimes called the African American Great Migration. And here is a image of how it looked, right? So as you can see, these were the beginnings of people leaving the Cotton Kingdom, leaving the Deep South, right? And going to where jobs were available. So for the first time, a large number of African Americans are going to New York City. Okay, this is where you're going to start to see people living in Harlem. South side of Chicago. So if you think about Chicago's South Side today, lots and lots of African Americans, the city of Detroit. So they're migrating to where industries are. Okay, they're migrating to where war factories are being built. And so they're filling in the jobs there. Now, at times, not always, but at times, they are going to be used as strike breakers. You guys remember? So like if the Wobblies are on strike, there might be a train load of African Americans brought up from the South to take their jobs. And so as you might imagine, when that occurs, when traditionally white communities have African Americans in their community, you're going to see some really terrible violence, really terrible race riots as a result of this. And so this will be an attack routinely on Black folks by white workers who are angry at either the presence of Black people in general or, and I would remind you, something that's kind of interesting to me about history is that throughout most of history, there were very few Black people, percentage-wise, living in the northern part of our country. You know, so that discussion about slavery, Southerners always felt like Northerners were, sort of arrogant to tell them what to do about African Americans because they didn't live around any, so to speak. And while I don't accept that because of the racism of it, I do accept the statistical reality of that. Like Black folks are now going to start leaving. Now, this is not the bulk. As you can see, this is a fairly small number during World War I, 70,000, but it's the beginning of what will ultimately be millions of people who migrate first to the industrial Midwest and the Northeast, and then to the West Coast, as you can see here. Now, what about women? And I'm going to talk more about Black folks after the war, because we're going to look at, for example, the Black Wall Street in Tulsa. But there are going to be lots and lots of violence towards African Americans during this period, and like I said, I'm going to show you more on that in the interwar period too. But women went to work, in large numbers. Large number of feminists were pacifists and also opposed the war. Okay, but it became pretty clear, and this is really the most important discussion, I think, of this moment, that there was a difference of opinion between Carrie Chapman Catt, the leader of NALSA, and Alice Paul, a young Quaker suffragette who had gone to Brown, I think it was Brown or Swarthmore, and had been in England, right, where the suffragettes in England were, literally battling there. And so when Alice Paul returns, Alice Paul asks Carrie Catt, this is Alice Paul, she asks her, can she, Alice Paul, take control of NALSA's Washington office? And at the time, NALSA was doing what we would call a state-by-state suffrage attempt. So they were trying to get every state in the Union to ratify women's suffrage in the state, so bypassing Congress, bypassing the president. And President Wilson had been very clear that he did not view at the time suffrage as something that was a priority for him. He didn't run on it, didn't care about it. But Alice Paul believed that until it was enshrined in the Constitution, that states could take it away, or that it needed to be a guaranteed right under the Constitution. And so Alice Paul is going to get the National Party in D.C., and she is going to organize very, very effectively a series of protests. Now, I do want to mention another feminist of the period who was the very first woman elected to Congress. This is Jeannette Rankin, Congresswoman from Montana. She was the first lady ever elected to, keep in mind, she was elected to Congress before women could vote nationally, guaranteed nationally. So the Western states allowed women, guaranteed women's suffrage. And here you can see her protesting World War II. So she's going to protest World War I and World War II and be the only person, you mentioned this the other day, the only person to vote against both World War I and World War II's resolution. So that's Jeannette Rankin, and I would certainly know her name, R-A-N-K-I-N. But I was mentioning Alice Paul, and what Alice Paul does is really landmark. She organizes one of the very first marches on Washington. It's not the first, but it's one of the first. And it's a parade. And her good friend, who is a feminist named Inez Milholland, will dress up as Liberty and ride on a white horse. This is Helen Keller leading a group of suffragettes by states that have suffrage for women. Somebody asked me one year, how did Helen Keller know which way to go? And I thought, but it's a fair question. I don't know what the technique they were using, but reminder that Helen Keller was indeed a very strong feminist. And so this march on Washington went very nicely until it was attacked by a group of men who beat the ladies up. Now, this was on Wilson's inauguration day. So it's kind of fascinating to see this sort of experience. Well, what it's going to lead to is Alice Paul doing something remarkable, and she is going to organize a group of women suffragettes, which are called the Iron-Jawed Angels or the Silent Sentinels. And so what they want to do is to protest Woodrow Wilson because they believe to get a national right to vote, they have to have the president's support. And so they're going to use language like Kaiser Wilson, very, very loaded phrase, right? Have you forgotten your sympathy with the poor Germans because they were not self-governed? 20 million American women are not self-governed. Take the beam out of your own eye. That's straight out of the Bible, right? Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty? Mr. President, what will you do for women's suffrage? Now, initially, they were protesting out front of the White House, like talking, and they got arrested. In fact, she's going to get waterboarded at an asylum during this, tortured during this. But then they adopt a silent standing in front of the White House, and they will frequently use the president's words against him. Like they'll take his words from a speech that are talking about self-determination, and then they'll hold it up and be like, but they don't talk. So they become known as the Silent Sentinels. And they bring and keep in mind, this is President Wilson has to go past these people every time he comes into the White House. So over time, the pressure is much stronger on President Wilson to support the 19th Amendment. And finally, Wilson changes his mind. He says it's a vital war measure to have women voting, because of their role in our society. And so when Wilson changes his position, the Democrats in Congress will go with him and will ratify, they'll pass the 19th Amendment, and then you'll get the necessary 38 states to vote to ratify it. I would point out with Alice Paul, she also proposes something that our state just ratified last year, although it's now expired because the time ran out on it. But the original Equal Rights Amendment, which would guarantee that rights in America cannot be denied based on sex, based on gender. So that amendment doesn't exist, but it certainly could have existed. And Alice Paul was the proposer of it. By the way, when she leaves NALSA, she founds a new group called the National Women's Party or Women's Party. So that's going to be this sort of successor from NALSA, a side group, so to speak. Now, women will be added to the Department of Labor as far as women's jobs and women's professions. However, I want to point this out as noteworthy. So after the war ends, the majority, and I mean the sizable majority of women go home, go back. So if asked what the chief profession of American women after World War I was, it was homemaker. Okay, that's what they did. They were homemakers. Now, during the war, women had a host of jobs. Now, nothing as sort of romantic as Rosie the Riveter. You know, there's no sort of World War I equivalent to that. But certainly women had roles in factories and farms. Okay. And you'll see here, for the first time, a federal law will be passed to help provide education for child rearing. So this is the very beginning of teaching mothers how to raise healthy children. So this will be part. It's called the Shepherd-Towner Maternity Act. So this Maternity Act is to kind of begin the process of understanding what those 9 months are about, you know, or really even before and after are about. So, you know, the federal government is going to take a more active role. Okay, that's women's rights, and you'll see women, the YWCA, the Salvation Army, the American Red Cross, and of course, women in nursing are going to do their part. You know, and so here you can see land service committees. The word service really appears a lot on these posters, doing their part. So this would be sort of like the early Rosie the Riveter. Here you can see the male figure walking out the door with the gun over his shoulder. You know, he's a doughboy, and who's putting on his work outfit is maybe his wife or you know, some other lady. So definitely women were active in the war effort, as you can see. It's nice to have women as a recruiting tool. So I don't know if the Navy would use this type of overt sexism anymore, but gee, I wish I were a man. I'd join the Navy, this lady's saying. Notice she's wearing a Navy Reserve uniform. And then here you got Help America's Sons, and it looks like sort of the ideal grandma or mom holding out, buy bonds. So lots of this stuff back here in the War of the Posters is about buying bonds and financing the war. We're going to use a whole lot of that. Okay. So probably one of the other most needed roles for women during the war was in the profession of nursing. And I really love these two pictures because they juxtapose so nicely. I've had a student figure out what this poster right here is a reminder of. Can anybody see what's going on in this poster? Yeah. Yeah, that's all right. The Pietà, very good. Michelangelo, good, Landon. So if you're familiar with the Pietà, it's Mary, the mother of Christ, holding the dead body of Jesus, who's like draped across in marble, right? So here's this large figure is a nurse, and she's holding very, you know, comforting this wounded soldier, you know. So she's the greatest mother in the world, like, kind of thing. And then this one is kind of fascinating to me because I look at it, maybe it's my mistake, but I look at it and it's almost like seductive, you know, like she's got this heavy eyeshadow on and she's got her hand outreached to you. So maybe put on a uniform and one of those pretty nurses might be, you know, I don't know if that's it or not, but definitely some interesting roles of women here. So what about serving in the military? Well, lots and lots of folks volunteered. I want to emphasize that, but ultimately that wasn't going to be enough. We weren't nearly going to have enough in terms of military personnel based on volunteerism. So you're going to see a conscription act. It's called the Selective Service Act, which you guys, and I do mean guys, still have to register for selective service, the draft. 24 million registered. About 2 million are going to go into combat. Okay. Another 2.5 million or so are going to be involved in the logistics and supplies and, you know, manning the bases. But about 2 million are going to go to France to fight. And of that number, about 400,000 are African Americans. So about a fifth of the army, of the service in combat are black soldiers, black troops. Also, Native Americans will play a role as scouts and scout snipers. So I've shown you here, and it's something very interesting. So, the president calls for a declaration of war, and this is after the sinking of our four merchant ships. And you see Pershing. Now, this is American movie, right? Like a movie made by the American government, and it calls his soldiers crusaders, right? So this is a noble cause, like crusade. That's the kind of word you use for a holy war. Right? But I pointed down here, this is a French gun, right? So when we arrive in Europe, we don't have guns. We haven't manufactured them yet. This is the French. It's pronounced Chauchat. It was the gun of, like, you wanted to, Chauchat. There it is, the French Chauchat. It was a LMG, a light machine gun with a bipod, and most of our guys had to resort to using rifles. Just rifles like the 308 Lee Enfield. But if you could get your hands on the French Chauchat, it's a machine gun. So that's pretty cool, right? The point is that we were really unprepared. Pershing's going to go over early with his adjutants, his generals that are under him, and then the Americans are going to start trickling into France. But soon it's a flood of Americans pouring into France, and so they don't have enough weapons. So they have to get them from the French. And keep in mind, the French have been borrowing money from us to get weapons, so they actually have the weapons, and so they supply us with it a lot of times. And then, if you've studied trench warfare, I don't give you a lot of details of the war itself, other than just reminder that this was the deadliest war in history until World War II. So this was extraordinarily deadly conflict, and over 500,000 men are going to die in combat in this, and another, I don't know, 1 million or so are going to die from illnesses. So illnesses are going to kill a lot of these guys in the trenches. And when they arrived, Pershing only had one order from Wilson. Wilson has no knowledge of military anything, so his only rule that he gives Pershing is do not serve under European command. So in other words, he warns them, when you get there, they're going to try to make you like their reinforcements. They're going to try to fill their shortages of people with us, and we must not do that. We must be an independent force working with them. But initially, America doesn't have a choice. When we get there, I want to remind you, the Russians have given up, right? The Russians have surrendered. They've had the revolution. They've signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and 500,000 German soldiers have just been brought off the Eastern Front and are moving to the Western Front. And they're launching an offensive, which is an assault. And our guys arrive just in time, literally, to fill the gaps at the Battle of the Second Marne. Now, that's huge because that's how close they were coming to Paris. And then we're going to have another battle or two at Bella Wood with the Marines in a place called Chateau Thierry. And what's noteworthy to me about all those battles is we were helping the French. Like, we were filling the gaps that if those gaps weren't filled, you would have seen the Germans overtake. Keep in mind that the nature of warfare throughout this whole thing is, sadly, you just throw men. You keep sending guys over the top, and they just get slaughtered. And that's still the pattern of warfare 4.5 years later. So when Pershing arrives, Pershing belongs to a group of military planners that believe in something called the cult of the bayonet, which was, if you can send enough dudes in a frontal charge with fixed bayonets, they'll override the enemy. The problem is when he starts talking about that, the French are like, you're insane. Like, we learned 4 years ago that was a big mistake. You can't lead a frontal charge against this thing because they have machine guns and they have tear gas, and you'll just get slaughtered. And so our first few battles are sort of non-consequential in the sense that they're important for the big picture of the war, but Pershing wants a place to test his battle theories out using just Americans. Okay. Now, in the meantime, I want to point out that African Americans are going to be some of the first to engage in combat, and they're going to do very well. Like they're going to, they're going to be decorated. And while they're in France, they are treated as Americans, not African Americans per se, but just Americans. So they're actually treated better in France than they are in America. There's no Jim Crow in France. There's no, I mean, these are just Americans who, keep in mind, the French are an empire, so they're used to having people of different ethnicities around, right? So these African Americans are like, wow, we're treated better here than back home. And so what's going to happen with a lot of these folks is when they return home, these, the word back then was colored for African American. These colored soldiers are going to be like, oh, we should fight for our rights here. So World War I is going to have sort of an interesting consequence of many of the veterans of World War I are going to become leaders in the African American civil rights movement in the decade to follow, the 20s. Okay, so definitely be aware of that these folks are going to have a neat experience, to say the least, and highly decorated. Now, I also want to remind you that we get to the game late, very late. So we declare war, but it's a year after our declaration. We declare war in 1917, but we don't arrive in France until April of 1918, so a year later. And in the meantime, I mentioned the Russians had lost, but in the civil war that followed in Russia, President Wilson does an astonishing thing, and he sends Americans to Russia to help the anti-red, anti-communist forces. So in the middle of World War I, Americans arrive in St. Petersburg to fight off the Reds. And if you know anything about history, that doesn't work, and that's going to be one of the reasons why Russia, not soon to be the Soviet Union, is going to have a long-term animosity to us because we tried to help stop the Bolsheviks. So you'll notice that the name of our unit, our group of soldiers as they were deployed, is called the American Expeditionary Force. That's what that AEF stands for. So we're on an expedition, you might think, right? And they're led by this fellow, General John Blackjack Pershing. And I remind you that, that name is not inconsequential. He had been called something else by his contemporaries who weren't going to use that. We're not going to use that language. While there, the French finally got a leader who would work with everybody involved. So the Frenchman who we're going to be collaborating with is Marshal Foch. That's how you pronounce that, F-O-C-H, Marshal Foch. And so Foch will, he'll be the one that talks to Pershing about, where to go, so to speak. Now, he can't give him direct orders, so he's not going to be ordering Pershing per se, but they're associates. So I've mentioned some of these battles, and I want to show you, here's the Second Marne. That was a crucial battle. Our very first engagement in World War I was a battle called Chateau Thierry, where we had to plug the gaps, and the Second Battle of the Marne. But by far the most important battle, and I think I should put a map of it up because this is the place I've been to in France to teach about and learn more about. So the name of the location is the Meuse Argonne, and this actually comes from the group I work for. So I've been down in this hole right here. I've walked along this. Pretty cool. So this battle that features some of the most famous decorated Americans of all time is called the Battle of Meuse Argonne, and that's named after a river. Yeah, this is us. This is my group right here. The Meuse River and the Argonne Forest. So let me show you Meuse Argonne. Wow, this is a giant picture. Sorry. Didn't realize it was going to be that big. Cool. So this is the kind of stuff that they were fighting in. And after 5 years of warfare, they had dug out some of the most complex tunnel systems. So these trenches are still there. Now that's on top. This right here is on top of something called the anthill. And the anthill is about I want to say about a 30-meter tall, maybe that's higher than that, maybe a 50-meter tall hill that is completely woven with tunnels. Both German and French tunnels have control of this thing. So we're going to be fighting here, and this is what you can see up in the top one of the monuments at the Meuse Argonne. But the thing about it is Pershing had always wanted to have his own area, right? Like since we arrived, we wanted to be in our own sort of zone or quadrant. So here is where I'll zoom it up now. If you look over here, you'll see that the Meuse River cuts down through here, right? And this it's a heavily forested place right here. Okay, so this is the Meuse Argonne as the battle lines were being finalized. Now, keep in mind, the Germans have come back in here, but when we arrive, they see all these, like, remember, it's like 2 million guys show up, like all these healthy, well-fed, not post-traumatic stress disordered, not shell-shocked Americans. And the biggest thing that that's going to do for the French and the Brits is give a big morale boost. Meanwhile, the Germans, I mean, if you've been fighting on the Eastern Front, that's terrible. You were fighting Russia. But now you got to fight against the healthy Americans who are completely, available and reinforced. So morale is a big one. Obviously, munitions, but it's not battles. This battle is not even really a victory. And I say that because, I mean, it is a victory in a sense that the war ends while this battle is going on. But we are going to try a frontal assault against this German Third Army that has 5 layers of trenches, like 5 corresponding zones. So you have to go through trenches, then another. It's a 5 times, and it's concrete reinforced. This is closest to Germany. This is the German border right here. So really, really brutal fighting. And if you've never heard the exploits of Sergeant Alvin York, this is a fellow who captures an entire German company of soldiers single-handedly. He was from Tennessee, and this is in the Battle of Meuse Argonne. So I'm sorry if I haven't made that battle clear. That's the battlefield where I was working, the cemetery. And so this is the only major battle that's truly our battle in World War I. Like all the others are sort of like battles we helped the French. This guy's from Tennessee. He's out on the periphery, like on the side with a small unit, not even a squad. He was a corporal at the time. And they come across a group of Germans sitting around a campfire, like a fire. And so they like capture them. Like, all right, you're our prisoners. And they're like, oh, okay. Lavash. Well, that would be French. So anyway, they capture these Germans, and then they're getting ready to march them out. And all of a sudden they're getting shot at from up the hill. York takes a flanking position up the side of the hill, and he can get in a position where he has side angle shooting. And so when they pop their head up, he shoots them. Now Sergeant York was a very uneducated Tennessee good old boy who happened to be one of the world's best sharpshooters, right? He'd done nothing but shoot squirrels and, game his whole life. And so when the Germans would stick their head up, he'd shoot them. So finally, they start a charge towards his position. It's just him, right? His other men, it's like 5 other guys are down at the bottom holding these Germans prisoners. And they're charging him, and he shoots them with the guy in the back first. So he'll shoot the guy in the back, and then the next guy in the back, so the guy in the front doesn't realize how many people are dead. And so the German down at the base of the hill yells up to the other Germans, stop running, and, out. He's going to kill you all. And so they surrender. Well, it's like 100 guys, and so here's York walking out like 100 dudes to his commander. And when he gets there, his colonel says, York, I hear you captured the whole damn German army. And it is. It's one of those amazing moments of bravery. And all across the war, you'll have examples like that. You had a fellow from right here in Mecklenburg County, in Halifax County, who, if you know anything about Virginia Tech, it has a ROTC unit, and the ROTC unit is named after this guy who'll be a Medal of Honor recipient, who does a very similar thing. Call him the Virginia York. So anyway, I put this battle in here, Meuse Argonne, and man, it is a neat place to visit, because this is the biggest battle in American history. This single battle. If you look at my data here, I once did for my work with ABMC, the American Battles and Monuments Commission. I went out on a man on the street interviews and asked American people just in Myrtle Beach. I was down there, and I asked people in Washington, D.C., and So I just asked them, what was the biggest battle in American history? Most of them would say Gettysburg, which is, a big battle, obviously, right here. A lot of them would say D-Day, which technically it's the breakout from D-Day that was the bigger battle. Some even did say the Battle of Bulge, which is the second largest battle. But if you look here, in 47 days, 26,000 Americans were killed because Pershing is using frontal assaults on these people. He's using fixed attack, like across no man's land, and they're getting slaughtered. And the good news is if you look here, November 11th is the day the war ends. We're still fighting literally the day the war ends. So at Meuse-Argonne. So that's going to be the biggest battle in American history, the most deadliest battle in American history. And it's a place in eastern France that most people never heard of. Now, out of this battle, it's kind of interesting thing to look at here, is a whole host of people who are going to go on to become very important. Now, that's not on your guide to your reading, but it is interesting to me. So we've already mentioned Pershing. He's very famous, and he has tanks named after him. This fellow right here is Captain Harry Truman. And Harry Truman is going to be an artillery commander who performs brilliantly. At one point, the Germans are about to overrun his position, and he'll lower his cannons. Keep in mind, cannons are like ranged weapons. He'll lower them straight ahead and fire them at the Germans coming, and he'll be successful. This young general is a young fellow named George S. Patton. He will go on to be one of the greatest tank commanders in history. He will get shot and almost killed in this battle. He gets shot through the rear end, and it almost severs his artery coming out the other side. But he'll be saved by an orderly. This general here will command what's called California's Rainbow Division, and his name is Douglas MacArthur. So General MacArthur will first become famous in the Battle of Meuse-Argonne. This general here is General George Marshall. He will later be in charge of the entire armed forces and the Marshall Plan, Secretary of State of the United States. And this is Billy Mitchell. He is the father of the American Air Force. So like all of these guys, this is their baptism of fire. If you think of the Mexican War as the baptism of fire for these Civil War commanders, the Battle of Meuse-Argonne is the preparation for World War II. These are going to be the guys in charge in the next war. Okay. So the war ends on the 11th day of the 11th month at the 11th hour. That they planned that. They wanted it to be like that. Or most notably, November 11th. It used to be called in history Armistice Day. An armistice is an agreement to stop fighting. And this is what the Germans think they do. The Germans believe they have ended the war under the agreements of the 14 points with one condition. Wilson only had one condition, and that is the King of Germany, the Emperor, has to give up being Emperor. So we call that abdicate. And the Kaiser quit. He quit and went and lived in Holland after this. All right. So that was the only condition Wilson made. The war itself is a complete disaster of human life, a complete, just unbelievably catastrophe for humans. 20 million casualties. And the numbers to this day are unclear on how many people died from the Spanish flu. So to mention the Spanish flu now and not go a little more in depth into it would be, I think, remiss on my part. So what's interesting to me is that the same number of Americans, 526,000, died from the Spanish flu in America as have now died from COVID. The difference is the way the rest of the world responded then and now. So back then, much of the world had no response to develop, to stop the spread of this flu. This was a coronavirus. It actually gets blamed on Spain, but it had nothing to do with Spain. It came from American military training in our country, probably in Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. So it seems like in the conditions of our soldiers being trained, somehow this novel coronavirus spread or started, jumped from animal to human. And then when they went to Europe, it spread throughout Europe rapidly. And because war conditions can you imagine the way we look right now with these masks and stuff, trying to fight a war, and so this is going to create one of the worst pandemics in human history. We're not exactly sure how many people died. You get all kinds of, your book, I think, says 30 million. One text says 20 million. Others say 100 million. Can't know for sure because they didn't keep detailed medical records. So like all across the world, people die from a coronavirus, the Spanish flu. And it was far more deadly than this, World War One. And so I find it ironic that everyone's heard of World War One, but until this pandemic, Spanish flu was not something most people are aware of, right? But it is interesting also to me that it's almost 100 years later to the year when the Spanish flu and the coronavirus, or the current one, spread. Now, we'll talk about tomorrow the 14 points as far as what it does to, well, let's see, tomorrow, Wednesday. Yeah, let's have like a 30-minute, no, tomorrow's Tuesday. I can pull that off tomorrow. Yeah. So notice here, no major battle victories. I'd like to consider the Meuse-Argonne a victory, but it certainly wasn't decisive, and it certainly didn't end the war, in other words. So really, this was our great contribution to the war effort. The enormous stores of food. When I say weapons, I mean weapons that they ordered. You know, it was weapons for them. We didn't have those weapons. Yeah, they purchased when we got to France. We had to get our guns that we had sold them from them. But of course, this was a huge day in history, and people were going to celebrate all across the world. The armistice was, you know. Keep in mind, though, an armistice is not a surrender. You hear that? It's peace without victory, isn't it? But the Germans and the British and the French have very different understandings of how this war ends. The British and the French believe they won, and the Germans are defeated people. The Germans believe they fought to a standstill and then agreed to stop fighting. So that's kind of a very big outcome when, you know, later on they're told, oh, by the way, you're completely responsible for the war and have to pay for it. Like, what? You know, so this is going to be kind of a big deal. All right. So, yeah, here's where 116,000 Americans get killed at the Somme. You know, and again, America's overall casualties are very, very low. But I remind you, they're only in the war for about 8 months, like literally in the war. And had Pershing continued to fight the way he was, keep in mind, in one battle, they're going to lose half of all that we lose in Korea. You know, a third of all we lose in Vietnam in one battle. And so had this war continued, I think it's very possible. I mean, Bella Woods on here. Look, Bella Woods right there. So very high for what America accepts as acceptable losses. Keep in mind, Americans, we're very picky about, we don't like casualty reports. So one of the things that's really surprised me about America in this pandemic is sort of the casual attitude of dismissing 526,000 Americans dead. You know, like people are like, man, you know, some people. And I find that really amazing considering, you know, these are our countrymen. But anyway, like I said, very few casualties. You'll notice on the flip side, the Russians, enormous casualties. You know, the Russians just absolutely got bled white. And then the Germans and Austro-Hungarians. So we'll pick up tomorrow in France when Wilson arrives, and he's going to make some real mistakes, and we'll see that. So that'll do it for today. Let me stop recording.